Hey, thanks for joining us again. We're in First Corinthians chapter 14. First Corinthians chapter 14, and we're picking up the second part of the chapter there. First Corinthians chapter 14, 26 through 40. First Corinthians chapter 14, 26 through 40. I hope you've got the workbook in front of you. Um, we've got it available on the website there at cadleonard.com. cadleonard .com. Hey, thanks for joining us again. We're in First Corinthians chapter 14. 1 Corinthians 14, 26 through 40, the second part of the chapter there. 1 Corinthians chapter 14, 26 through 40. Hope you've got the workbook in front of you. If you don't have it, you can find it on the website, cadleonard.com, cadleonard.com. If you'd like to follow along with us that way, you can. We're in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, 26 through 40. We've covered the first part of the chapter. I'll just quickly remind us again that we're in the block 12 through 14 concerning spiritual gifts. The problem has been lovelessness. They want to show out with their flashy gifts. They're more interested in impressing people than they are edifying people. And Paul says love will fix the whole thing. If you love people, you'll start to gear yourself for edification purposes rather than for impressive purposes. And there's a word of caution to us preachers. When we get in the pulpit or when we lead singing, we ought to be doing what we're doing, not for impressing people, but for edification. So in 1 Corinthians 14, we were tailing off last time. We were noting a couple of those phrases that Paul uses in 1 Corinthians 14. Oh, if you look at 19, however, in the church, in the ecclesia. 14:23, if the whole church, the ecclesia, assembles together, comes together, sunerkaste. 14:26, when you assemble. And then a number of times you'll see 28, in the church. 33, in all the churches. 34, in the churches. 35, speak in church. Interesting observations. They lead us to the conclusion he's talking about an assembly context. Now, I made this point in the end of the last video, and I need to make it again. This is important in our interpretation of chapter 11. We don't have any notation like that in chapter 11, 2 through 16. You see, there's a modern push from the radical feminist crew to say that 1 Corinthians 11, 5, the woman prays or prophesies, publicly teaches. That's got to be in an assembly context, but I don't think that's justifiable. In 1 Corinthians 11, 2 through 16, there's nothing to hint that he's talking about an assembly context there. And I think that in 1 Corinthians 14, he's going to give us teaching that's cutting against that view. He's going to actually tell us about the woman taking the lead in public worship, that it's out of place. 1 Corinthians 14, 34 and 35. In 1 Corinthians 11, 5, then, I don't think he's talking about a typical assembly context. I think he's probably assuming it's an all-female assembly. 1 Corinthians 11, 5. 1 Corinthians 14's interpretation will push me to that view. There's nothing in the context of 1 Corinthians 11 to suggest he's talking about an assembly context, while in 1 Corinthians 14, he knows how to note when he's talking about an assembly context. In 1 Corinthians 11, there's nothing like that. So, back to 1 Corinthians 14, we're in the middle of a discussion on then using the gifts, our giftedness, as it pertains to the assembly, in an assembly context. In 1 Corinthians chapter 14, we're going to take it from 26 down through 40. Let's go ahead and read. Let's do the whole thing, I suppose. 1 Corinthians 14, 26. Read it with me. 1 Corinthians 14, 26. What is the outcome then, brethren? Now remember, he's just come off the business about the tongue speaking. What is the outcome then, brethren? When you assemble, each one has a psalm, has a teaching, has a revelation, has a tongue, has an interpretation. Here's his line again. Let all things be done for edification. Verse 27. If anyone speaks in a tongue, it should be by two or at the most three. Each should be in turn. One must interpret. If there's no interpreter, keep silent in the church. Let him speak to himself and to God. 29. Let two or three prophets speak, and let the others pass judgment. But if a revelation is made to another who is seated, the first one must keep silent. Keep silent. We've seen that before. Verse 31. For you can all prophesy one by one, so that you all may learn and all may be exhorted. And the spirits of the prophets are subject to the prophets. 4, verse 33. God is not a God of confusion, but of peace, as in all the churches of the saints. Verse 34. The women are to keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but are to subject themselves, just as the law also says. Verse 35, if they desire to learn anything, let them ask their own husbands at home. And Paul says, it is improper for a woman to speak in church. My, that's gotten some interpretation over the years. Verse 36, was it from you that the word of God first went forth? Or has it come to you only? Verse 37, if anyone thinks he's a prophet or spiritual, let him recognize that the things that I write unto you are the Lord's commandment. Verse 38, but if anyone does not recognize this, he is not recognized. Therefore, my brethren, desire earnestly. Ooh, sounds familiar, doesn't it? Desire earnestly to prophesy, and do not forbid to speak in tongues. But, verse 40, all things must be done properly and in an orderly manner. Oh, all right. Let's start to unpack some of this. Number 17 in the workbook. This section, 14:26 through 40, begins a new section that deals with order/conduct. Order/conduct in the Christian assembly. Now, the text of 1 Timothy has something similar. Listen to this in 1 Timothy 3 and verse 15. Paul says about that epistle, assuming that Paul is the writer of 1 Timothy, and I think that text says, Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, according to the commandment, 1 Timothy 1:1. The scholarly consensus is that Paul didn't write 1st, 2nd Timothy. I can't get on board with that to save my life. 1 Timothy 3:15, the superscription, the very first words of the epistle say Paul, an apostle. And the scholars tell us, well, it wasn't actually Paul. It was a fellow feigning to be Paul. I can't get on board with the view. Pardon me. 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 15, Paul says in 1 Timothy 3:15, I am writing so that you will know how one ought to conduct himself in the household of God, the church of the living God, the pillar and support of the truth. Paul says he writes 1 Timothy to let us know about how we should conduct ourselves in church, in assembly. All right. That's what 1 Timothy 3 says. What had Paul just said in 1 Timothy chapter 2? In a very similar context, 1 Timothy chapter 2, 8 through 15, he says that the woman must quietly receive instruction, not usurp authority or teach or exercise authority over a man, but remain quiet. Similar to 1 Corinthians 14. Maybe we should unpack that text here in a moment too. 1 Timothy chapter 2. After all, 1 Corinthians 11, 1 Corinthians 14, and 1 Timothy chapter 2 are all strikingly similar in some ways. Paul is restricting the woman from taking the lead in some ways. At least he is in 1 Corinthians 14 and 1 Timothy chapter 2. He's not so clear in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, which makes me think that he's not talking about an assembly context. But you might say at this point, is 1 Timothy chapter 2 actually talking about an assembly context? Remains to be seen. Let's see if we can unpack that here in a minute. Back to 1 Corinthians chapter 14. Back to 1 Corinthians chapter 14. In this context, 1 Corinthians 14, it's a new section that deals with order or conduct in the Christian assembly. Paul is giving rules for a spirit-led spontaneous gathering, and he's prohibiting disorder or interruptions. Now, you'll remember, in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, of course, they didn't have something like a printing press, and so they don't have a church bulletin. They don't have a work roster. They don't have anything telling them, here's the person to lead singing for the day, here's the person to lead prayer. And so it's easily seen how when the Spirit leads them in the assembly, that needs worked out, by the way, and I'm not going to unpack that here, but when they come together for assembly in the house church, it's easy to see how this could turn chaotic real quick. one fellow says he's going to lead singing, another says he's leading singing, and it's time for them to start praising God. And there's some kind of collision about who's going to do the song leading. Then they say, now we're going to have opening prayer, but they've not called on anybody. And so everybody sits there and glares at each other. Who's got the opening prayer this morning? You can see how this gets chaotic. And then when it comes time for the public speaking, you've got tongue speakers who want to talk. And Paul's already said a little bit about, well, we need to make sure that's even going to be edifying. There needs to be an interpreter. And then there's the fellow who's going to do the preaching for the day, a public speaker. But Johnny and Bill and Jim, they all want to do the public speaking. And so there's a little bit of a disruption there. And then there's this discussion about whether or not women should be the lead talkers, the public speakers. And so there's chaos. Paul is writing to provide instruction or advice on how to organize or order the assembly. It's an assembly context. That's what 1426 is saying. He's talking about an assembly context in the churches, when the church comes together. That's what he's talking about. So in 1 Corinthians 14, he's going to give us, should we say, some structure to lead us in the assembly arrangement. Now we ought to observe this. There are 3 groups. Oh, if you make notes, you need to make this. Number 18 has this as part of the blank. Number 18, Paul addresses 3 separate groups. If you've got the workbook, there are 3 separate groups. Here they are. You look at it in 14:27. If anyone speaks in a tongue. Group number 1, tongue speakers. 14:29. Prophets. Let 2 or 3 prophets speak. Group number 2, prophets. Those who do the public speaking. Tongue speakers, group 1. Prophets, group 2. 14:34, the women. Group 3, the women. You have 3 groups. Tongue speakers, prophets, women. Paul addresses 3 distinct groups. Now, you will notice this. You will notice this if you're sticking close to the text, which I hope you are. You'll notice that what Paul does in each of these cases, his structure is exactly the same. He starts out, he names the groups. He names them in 14:27, tongue speakers. 14:29, prophets. 14:34, women. So he starts out in each case. The first thing he does, he names the group. The second thing he does is he states the rule. Watch this. In 14:27, he states the rule. Anyone speaks in a tongue should be by 2 or at the most 3. Everybody needs to be in turn, and one must interpret. So for the first group, the tongue speakers, he states the rule. Watch this on 14:29. 2 or 3 prophets should speak. He states the rule. Others should pass judgment. And then, regarding the women are to keep silent in the churches. They are not permitted to speak, but they are to subject themselves, just as the law says. So what he does is he names the group. He states the rule for that group, and then he gives an example. He gives an example in some kind of conditional form. Watch this on 14:28. Regarding the tongue speaker, if no interpreter, keep silent in the church. Let him speak to himself and to God. 14:30, the prophets, if a revelation is made to another, who is seated, the first one must keep silent. You can prophesy one by one. You all may learn, all may be exhorted. Spirits of the prophets are subject to the prophets. God's not a God of confusion or of peace. Verse 34, third group, what he does is he gives an example. If they desire to learn anything, they can ask their husbands at home. Now, in each of these cases, he names the group, he states the group, he states the rule governing the group, and then what he does is he gives an example, but then the fourth thing he does in each case is he justifies the rule. Why are these the rules pertaining to these groups? Watch this. 14 and verse 28. If there's no interpreter, keep silent in the church. Let him speak to himself and to God. 31. It should be all that may learn. All should learn. All may be exhorted. The spirits of the prophets, by the way, are subject to the prophets. God's not a God of confusion. That makes sense. That's why he's restricting. He's putting restrictions, Not only on the women. Keep this in mind. He is not only restricting women. So it's not a chauvinistic, sexist, feministic issue. Paul is restricting the tongue speakers, the prophets, and the women to some extent. Now watch this. And then on 1435, it's improper for a woman to speak in church, is what he says. So he restricts all three groups. What he does, he names the group, he states the rule governing that group, he gives an example pertaining to that group, and then he justifies the rule that he has given upon that group. He does that for all three. Who are our three groups again? Let's remind ourselves. Tongue speakers, prophets, women. All three groups. Paul uses the same structure. He lays out the same structure and addresses them. Now, I'm interested to see how I want to go about this. Let's go ahead and go to the workbook. I'll come back to some of this. On number 18, we should observe this. Each group is told to be silent. Oh, that is striking. Look at that on 14 and verse 34. I'll work backwards here for a second. Look at 14:34 if you have your English text in front of you, and I certainly hope you do. 1 Corinthians 14:34. The women are to keep silent in the churches. More than one naive, probably well-intentioned brother or sister has made this argument. When he says on 14:34, keep silent, that means absolute silence. I've heard more than one, sadly, more than one individual say, now that Greek word sagao means absolute silence, no audibility. First of all, before we even unpack that, does that even hold? If it means absolute silence, not to be heard at all, what if the woman coughs? What if the woman sneezes and she is heard in the churches? That would technically violate this understanding of sagao. Let's go a step further. I wonder, she's supposed to be absolutely silent, not heard at all. Is she supposed to sing? Now we start to run into some problems. Yeah, I suppose she's supposed to sing. Okay, so now all of a sudden sagao, maybe we're having to soften up a bit. Maybe sagao doesn't mean absolute silence after all. But perhaps what's most striking is from the context itself. Is it only the female that's told to be silent in the churches? Look back at 14:28. Here we are, 14:28. Now remember, in 14:27, he starts off by addressing the tongue speakers. 14:28, he's talking to the tongue speakers. 14:28, if there is no interpreter, he must keep silent in the church, in assembly. Oh, so he gives some kind of conditions. He gives conditions and says, even to the tongue speaker, even though if they're male, masculine, he says, keep silent if you don't meet the right conditions. That's striking. Look at 14:30. Now he's talking to the prophets, the public speakers. 14:30. If a revelation is made to another who is seated, the first guy better keep silent. Sagao, same word. 14:28. The tongue speakers are silenced. 14:30. The prophets are now being silenced, given the conditions. Then 14:34, third group. He addresses all three and says, under these circumstances, silence. With the first two groups, the tongue speakers and the prophets, does Paul mean to silence them in church to the extent that they can never talk again? That's not his point. He's setting forth some circumstances under which they can speak and which they cannot speak. But this is interesting. The idea of being silent sets itself over against the idea of speaking. Let that sink in. I'll say it again. Silence, sagao, sets itself over against, it's the direct opposite, antithetical. It's antithetical to the idea of speaking. Silence is set over against speaking. Silence is set over against speaking. Is there something significant about that? Well, let's pick it up here. Look at 14:27 again. 14:27. If anyone speaks in a tongue. 29. 2 or 3 prophets speak. Paul says that they can speak. The tongue speaker can speak. The prophet can speak. But then he gets down into 14:34. The women cannot speak. It's improper, 35, for a woman to speak in church. Now, let's pause for a second. A word like sagao, a word like speak, silence, speak, those words, just like all other words, can only mean what the author, writer, speaker intends for them to mean. Let this point sink in. If I were to tell you, well, let me actually test you. What does the word foot mean? You say, okay, that's an appendage on the human body. Another person says, the word foot, it's 12 inches. Okay. What does the word mouth mean? Oh, mouth. Opening. Mouth means opening. It could be the mouth of the cave. Well, mouth, that's a little imprecise. Mouth needs to probably be understood as it's a part of the human body. Mouth is a part of the human body, does the talking, etc., etc. Okay. Those are lexical dictionary definitions, and neither of those even come close to handling the phrase. If I say, oh, you wouldn't believe it, she put her foot in her mouth. All of a sudden, if we try to understand that quite literally, not as an idiom, not as a metaphor, not as an illustration, not in its contextual use, we walk away with a misguided understanding of what it means to put his foot or put her foot in her mouth. The expression means something like, oh, she ate crow, ate her words. We understand that expression. We use it in the States anyway. But a lexicon's not going to give us that. A lexicon only tells us how words are sometimes used in popular usage. But it doesn't give us context. And so while you might look up in a lexicon, well, the word here, foot, means 12 inches, or the word mouth here means opening, it's not going to reckon with, it's not going to handle the phrase, he put his foot in his mouth, as used in a context by a speaker, writer, author. Right? Here's my point. In 1 Corinthians, we've got to let Paul use the words silent and the word speak as Paul wishes to use them, for pity's sake. I'm getting passionate about this, aren't I? 1 Corinthians 14. Silence stands over against the word speak. What does he mean? Does he mean complete inaudibility, silence? And when he says speak, does he mean even saying the word please or thank you to the person passing the collection plate or the Lord's Supper, the elements? Is that what he means? What if this, and this I think is borne out by the context, what if silence and speaking are in reference to taking the lead? What if silence and speaking are in reference to taking the lead? Oh, now that starts to make much better sense. How does that make sense? Well, look back at chapter 14. You've got your English text in front of you. 14:27. If anyone speaks, by which Paul means take the lead, if anyone takes the lead as a tongue speaker, it should be by 2 or at the most 3. Now, he says you need to take turns. We don't need chaos where you're all running over each other. I've got brethren who do that. Can't let a fella finish his sentence. You got to interrupt his story or his joke or whatever. That's rude. Paul says no more of that chaotic business here. 14, that's why I like doing these videos. 14 and verse 27. If there's a tongue speaker who takes the lead, he should do it by 2 or at the most 3. You need to take turns. There needs to be an interpreter. If there isn't an interpreter, he must, here's your word, sagao, keep silent. Same word used with the women. He must silence in the church and let him speak to himself and to God. He doesn't mean to say no more talking for this group ever again in church. He doesn't mean to say they're out of place for taking the lead. He simply means to say, if you don't meet the circumstances, then this group of tongue speakers can't take the lead. Oh, if Bill's a tongue speaker, but there's no interpreter, Bill still needs to be singing. If they've got Bill down to lead prayer that morning, Bill still needs to lead prayer. He's not completely restricted from being audible, you see. When it says let him keep silence, he means to say he better not take the lead exercising this gift, given the confines. What if Bill is the 5th buddy that's got the tongue speaking gift that morning? Silence. Only 2 or 3. Better be in turn. What if Bill tries to talk over Johnny, who's already talking, and he's a tongue speaker, and there's an interpreter? Stop talking, Bill. It's not your turn. What if there's not an interpreter? Bill, don't use your tongue speaking gift. Paul is placing confines on what the speaking, taking the lead, should look like. He's telling us what form or appearance it should take, the confines about it. And he says the public speaking is set over against, silence, by which he means not taking the lead. Does that make sense? I think it makes sense. Let's see if it doesn't hold. Look at chapter 14 and verse 29. 2 or 3 prophets, let them speak, by which he means let the 2 or 3 prophets take the lead. And let the others pass judgment. But, verse 30, if a revelation is made to another who is seated, the first one must keep silence. He doesn't mean stop leading and stop singing along with the service. He doesn't mean that you can't cough or sneeze, as pitiful as an illustration that is. He's not saying be completely inaudible. He's saying it's not right for you to take the lead. Silence is set over against taking the lead. When we get to the women, we have the same thing. He's not commanding then on verse 34 that the women don't sneeze, cough, sing, etc. Say thank you for passing the collection plate. He's saying that the women are to, as he uses the word sagao in context, not take the lead. Anybody who says that this means complete inaudibility just restricted not only the women. Let this sink in. You say that sagao means complete inaudibility. You've just restricted the tongue speakers. You've just restricted the prophets. And why? If they're males, why? Why? He's not saying that. Paul's use of the word, if we let him use the word as he, the author, uses the word in the context, not some clinical, detached, sterile, lexical definition. If we let Paul say what Paul's saying, he's not completely silencing them, making all of these groups inaudible. As much as he's saying, look at 1434, the women are to not take the lead in the assembly, for they are not permitted to take the lead, speak, but are to subject themselves, just as the law also says. If they desire to learn anything, let them ask their husbands at home. And here's his justification of the rule. It is improper for a woman to speak, take the lead in the assembly, in church. That's his argument. We need to understand that silence is set over against speaking, and both of these words, silence and speaking, are in reference to taking the lead. That helps us. That helps us tremendously, I think. Now, let's go back here to our workbook. Each group is told to be silent. Sagao is in reference to taking the lead, and they are told to be silent in relation to the disruption that they are causing. Let that sink in. Why would Paul silence the tongue speakers? They're being chaotic, disrupting. Why would Paul silence the prophets? They're being chaotic, disrupting. Why might Paul silence the women? let's go ahead and fill in the blank here for a second. Because they're being chaotic or disrupting. But is that all that Paul's doing? Oh, I think we need to hold that in question. Is that all that Paul's doing here? Is he only telling women, you need to silence, not take the lead? But if you're not causing chaos or disruption, then you can take the lead. Interestingly enough, we need to make this observation, and this is our blank on 18. Paul, however, gives conditions. Your blank is conditions. Paul gives conditions where the tongue speakers or the prophets can speak or take the lead. Does Paul say that the tongue speakers can speak in church? Yeah. If they meet these conditions. 2 or at the most 3. In turn, there's an interpreter. Is there a condition under which the prophets could speak or take the lead? Yeah, there is. He says it in 14:29. Let 2 or 3 speak. Others need to pass judgment. If a revelation is made to another who's seated, the first one then needs to keep silent. Yeah, there are conditions under which the prophets can speak. So he gives conditions by which the tongue speakers, who he has silenced under certain circumstances or confines, can take the lead. Even though he silenced the prophets, there are certain conditions that, if met, they could take the lead. Does he give us conditions where now, if the women do this, this, or that, they can speak or take the lead? Oh, let's see. 1 Corinthians 14:34. The women are to keep silent. So he silences them in the churches. They're not permitted to speak, take the lead. They're not permitted to take the lead. But they are to subject themselves, just as the law also says. If they desire to learn anything, let them ask their husbands at home. And he just baldly states, it's improper for a woman to speak, take the lead in church. Do you find that interesting? I do. He doesn't give conditions either way. And here's what I mean. He doesn't give conditions by which the woman should be silent. He just simply says she should be. By which he means she mustn't take the lead. He doesn't give conditions where she can speak, take the lead. Paul is noticeably stating that the woman has no place taking the lead in the assembly context. Isn't that right? I think that's right. Now, with the way 14:34 and 35 reads then, how does that sit with 1 Corinthians 11:5, where she is prophesying? Obviously, it's some form of public atmosphere. Why? She's prophesying. She's got to have listeners. I mean, she's not going to just be talking to herself, I don't think. She's prophesying. She's doing public speaking. With what Paul's just said on 1 Corinthians 14:34 and 35 about the woman not being permitted to take the lead, speak in the assembly context, I'm forced to think that in 1 Corinthians 11:5, the context there, 1 Corinthians 11:5, is an all-female gathering, something like a ladies' day or a ladies' Bible class. And we've talked about that. If you want more on that, go back to 1 Corinthians 11 and watch that segment, 1 Corinthians 11, 2 through 16. Now, I should also say this. Back in 1 Corinthians 12 and verse 13, he had said, whether Jew or Gentile, whether slave or free. And now I think he's making the argument somewhat, he's reserved his discussion for whether male or female. He's not eroding the roles of the male and the roles of the female. There are still distinct roles that still exist. Even though you're in Christ, there are still roles. You're still one or the other. You're still a certain gender, sex. But when it comes to salvation, we're all on an equal playing field. And never in these discussions, by the way, is Paul talking about superiority or inferiority. But in Galatians 3:27 and 28, he says, for as many of you as have been baptized into Christ, have put on Christ. There's no longer any Jew nor Gentile, male, female, bond free. You are all one in Christ. The male's not superior to the female, never has been, by the way. It's not a question about superiority or inferiority. in First Corinthians ever, nor in Galatians. But when it comes to salvation, there's not a role that you have to meet in order to be saved in Christ. As far as like a status as a human being, I mean to say, we are all one on an equal playing field. The roles are useless when it comes to we are all in need of the blood of Christ. Never. It's a discussion about inferiority, superiority, even in discussions like roles in 1 Corinthians 11 and 14. We are equals, male and female. But let's not forget that we do have distinct roles. Your next blank on number 18 is conditions. Conditions. Now, I think at this point we should probably make a couple of observations. I'm going to make two. And the first, I'll tell you what they will be. The first observation we need to make is this. We need to talk about whether or not 1 Corinthians 14, 34 and 35, the restriction of the female, is what's called an interpolation. I'll talk about that here in a second. The second observation we're going to make, both of these will be a bit lengthy, will be we need to discuss 1 Timothy chapter 2. 1 Timothy chapter 2. Okay, we need to talk about whether or not 1 Corinthians 14, 34, and 35 is an interpolation. And the second thing we need to do is talk about 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 8 through 15. Let's start with the interpolation business. The view that 1 Corinthians 14, 34, and 35 is an interpolation is this. 1 Corinthians, as a letter, had been written. It was shipped off to the churches. And one day, one of those scribes got the 1 Corinthians letter, and he decided he was going to copy it. Well, he got down to 1 Corinthians chapter 14, where Paul is addressing the assembly context and edification and tongue speaking, all that. And the scribe got this idea that he was going to take a little bit of liberty with Paul's text and started copying in 1 Corinthians 14, 34, and 35. Here's what the view suggests. The view suggests that 1 Corinthians 14, 34, and 35 are not authentic to Paul. In other words, they were added later by a redactor or a scribe, an editor, and they were placed there not by Paul's hand, but by some later hand. Does that view hold? Some of the leading scholars today think this, by the way. I think that there are reasons, strong reasons, almost, well, I think they're unrefutable, as to why that view doesn't hold. Let me go through a couple of these. Number one, I would have to question, even if the manuscripts had this verse placed later, the first question I would have is, why did the scribes put that in there? Wouldn't it have been much easier if Paul hadn't written 1 Corinthians 14, 34, and 35 for them to leave that out? Why would they now place this restrictive 2 lines, 34 and 35, on the women? I don't know. The second thing is this. 14, 34, and 35, as we've noted, follows the same structure or pattern as the pattern to the tongue speakers and the prophets. Let me say it again. Here was the structure. Paul names the group, states the rule, gives an example, justifies the rule. My question would be this. Was a scribe that might have put this text, 1 Corinthians 14, 34, and 35, interjected that, slipped it in, was the scribe wise enough to pick up on that and copy that rule, that structure, that fourfold structure that Paul had used of the tongue speaker and the prophets? Was the scribe able to pick up that was Paul's structure and duplicated it perfectly, now just in relation to women, this third group? It also makes me question why the scribe might or might not have gone back and edited more of this. And it raises serious questions on whether or not we can really trust that any of this is authentic to Paul. But going back to my first argument with the manuscript evidence, there is no hint that this was some later text that only slipped in later by some extra hand some scribal, redactive, editing hand. No evidence for that. So there's no manuscript evidence. The structure of 1434 and 35 makes me think that it's from the same hand that wrote the earlier parts there from 26 through 33. But then also the contradiction with chapter 11:5. It would seem to me that an editor would have smoothed that out. See, 11:5 has the woman praying or prophesying, taking the lead. But I think that if an editor came along, other than Paul, and wrote 1434 and 35, I would have thought that the editor would have gone back into chapter 11 and verse 5 and smoothed that over, or just reduced it, taken it out of the text entirely, so that the apparent contradiction with 1434 and 35 didn't even exist. All in all, I think the view that this is an interpolation fails. I don't think that it bears the marks of a legitimate view. I think 1434 and 35 are authentic to Paul. And I think that for the three reasons I just gave. You missed those, go back and pick up the video here just 5 minutes prior, and you'll get those three reasons again. That's the first thing I needed to say. I don't believe, not even close, that 1 Corinthians 14, 34, and 35 is an interpolation from some extra Pauline hand. Now, our second thing we need to address, let's flip over to 1 Timothy chapter 2. 1 Timothy chapter 2. Let's see if we can't establish the same thing that we just established from 1 Corinthians 14 in reference to the taking the lead, speaking, and silence in an assembly context. Let's read this. 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 8. 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 8. Therefore, I want the men in every place to pray, lifting up holy hands without wrath and dissension. 2:9. Likewise, I want women to adorn themselves with proper clothing, modestly and discreetly, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly ornaments, but rather, verse 10, 1 Timothy 2:10, by means of good works, as is proper for women making a claim to godliness. 2:11. A woman must quietly receive instruction with entire submissiveness. And in 2:12 he says, but I do not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man, but to remain quiet. And now he justifies his rule. For it was Adam who was first created, and then Eve. And it was not Adam who was deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into transgression. But women will be preserved through the bearing of children, if they continue in faith and love and sanctity with self-restraint. Now, ideally, we would be able to go through this context a little more thoroughly, but I want to just basically get the big point across. Let me make a couple of big points about 1 Timothy chapter 2, 8 through 15. Let me start by saying this. In order for a female to be out of role, usurp authority over the man, and be wrong for it, I think that three things need to be present. And I think this is borne out in 1 Corinthians 14 and 1 Timothy 2. Three things need to be present in order for a female to unjustifiably usurp authority over the man. Three things. Number one, the female needs to take the lead. The female needs to take the lead. She needs to go to the microphone, or she needs to be the one at the lectern, or she needs to be the one standing up as she is recognized as having the authority. She needs to take the lead. Number two, it needs to be a mixed audience, males and females. Number three, it needs to be an assembly context. Let me actually just go ahead and script these out so you can see it. I'm a visual guy. I don't know if you are or not. Number one, what did I say number one was? Number one, she needs to take the lead. Take the lead. Number 2, it needs to be a mixed audience. Number 3, it needs to be an assembly context. Okay, let me show you. This is our list. If you make notes, these would be good to put down, I do think. Take the lead, mixed audience, assembly context. Take the lead, mixed audience, assembly context. I think that all 3 of these things need to be present in order for a female to usurp authority. Here's what I mean to say. What if the woman is in a mixed audience, men and women in a Bible class? It's a Bible class, so it's an assembly context. But she asks a question or makes remarks from the pew. She has not taken the lead. She's letting the teacher, male, do his teaching. But she has a question or a comment, and she'd like to add it. She doesn't take the lead, but it's a mixed audience, male and female. It's in a Bible class setting or a sermon or something like that. It's an assembly when the church has come together for an assembly purpose. But she hasn't taken the lead. I don't think she's usurping authority. And I think Paul's saying as much. Number 2, what if she takes the lead? She goes to the microphone. She's going to take the lead to lead prayer or preach. But it's not a mixed audience. It's only women. It's a ladies' day. It's a Bible class. It's a sermon. So it's an assembly context. She does take the lead, but there are no males present. I don't think she's usurped authority. Or what about if she goes to the microphone, she takes the lead. It's a mixed audience. Males and females are there. But she's simply informing them about the parking spots at the football game. She's not even at an assembly. It's at a football game. What if she then takes the lead over the males and the females, but it's not an assembly context? I don't think she's usurped authority. I don't think she's guilty, of the violations that Paul's addressing in 1 Corinthians 14 or 1 Timothy chapter 2. Now, with that in mind, can we establish then that 1 Timothy chapter 2 is discussing an assembly context? It's clear enough in 1 Corinthians 14 now, isn't it? In 1 Corinthians 14, it's clear enough that it's an assembly context. When you come together as the church, in the churches, in all the churches, those phrases are all over 1 Corinthians 14. 1 Timothy 2 isn't quite so clear. But let's see if I can't make an argument to suggest that 1 Timothy 2 is also about an assembly context. The first thing I would say is this. If you look at 1 Timothy chapter 3 again, 1 Timothy 3:15, Paul says he wrote these things so you might know how to conduct yourself in the household of God, the church of the living God, the pillar and support of the truth. He's talking about conduct in the church. He means in the assembly, I think. But if you go back to 1 Timothy chapter 2 even, 1 Timothy chapter 2, he says, 2:8, therefore I want the men in Ponti topo. I want the men in every place. And that phrase in the Greek, in Ponti, in every topo place, I think is an assembly context. Why do I think that? I've got about 6 or 7 reasons. The first one is this. The phrase is shorthand in every place. It is shorthand for holy place, in the holy place. Acts 6, put this down if you take notes and look at it in your own time. Acts 6:13 and 14. Acts 6:13 and 14. I wish I could read it. I really do. Acts 6:13 and 14 looks like it's shorthand for in the holy place. Give it a look. The second reason I think that is that it's a Hebrew idiom. In every place is a Hebrew idiom for assembly. Why? In 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 2. 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 2. Listen to this. To the church of God which is at Corinth, to those who have been sanctified in Christ Jesus, saints by calling, with all who in every place call on the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Here's 2 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 14. 2 Corinthians 2 and verse 14. We manifest through us the sweet aroma of the knowledge of him in every place. And then there's once more that he uses it in 1 Thessalonians chapter 1. 1 Thessalonians chapter 1 and verse 8. For the word of the Lord has sounded forth from you not only in Macedonia and Achaia, but also in every place. your faith toward God. I think it's a Hebrew idiom for assembly. And I think that 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 15, Paul's writing in 1 Timothy is for the purpose of conducting ourselves appropriately in the church of the living God. He's telling us it's an assembly that he's got in view, I think. I think that's our second reason. Number one, it's shorthand for holy place. Number two, it's a Hebrew idiom for the assembly. Number three, it's an Old Testament echo, which sits nicely with two, that it's a Hebrew idiom. Number three, it adapts Malachi 1, 10 and 11. Now, if you go back to Malachi 1, 10 and 11, wouldn't you know that under the Old Testament, it's talking about an assembly atmosphere. 1, 10 and 11, he's talking about them bringing forth their sacrifices, making offering to God in every place. Incense, connect that up with 2 Corinthians 2:14, where they're manifesting the aroma, the incense, the smell, the savor. 2 Corinthians 2:14 is drawing on Malachi 1:11. Why wouldn't we think 1 Timothy 2:8 is? Same phrase. In Ponti topo, in every place. Malachi 1:11 in the Septuagint is being echoed by 1 Timothy 2:8. That's all there is to it. For Malachi 1:11, they're making sacrifices, offerings, the incense is coming up. It's before God. They're worshiping God. In every place, incense is going to be offered to my name. So argument number three, why do I think in every place in 1 Timothy 2:8 is an assembly context? He's echoing Malachi 1, 10 and 11. Here's our fourth reason. It's overwhelmingly biblical. The phrase in Ponti topo is overwhelmingly biblical. I think it was, don't quote me on this. It's been a while since I looked at some of this. Everett Ferguson, I think it was, documented that phrase is very rare in Ponti topo. It's very rare in secular Greek. In all of the extant biblical or secular Greek literature, that's not the way they say everywhere. They have a word for everywhere. They don't use in Ponti topo, in every place, to say everywhere in the secular literature. That's interesting. And then number five, it looks like Paul is limiting this to the males. 2:8, I want the men in every place to take the lead in praying. Set that over against 2:9, I want women to adorn themselves with proper clothing. Now, he limits that. That word men on 2:8 is males, aner, not anthropos, humanity, human beings. It's the males. I want the males to pray in every place. He's not excluding females ever from praying, you see. He's limiting this to the assembly context. In the assembly, males should take the lead. He's not hardly saying in 2:8 that he's hardly saying on 2:8 that women should never pray. He's saying that the men in every place, the assembly context is what he's got in view, are the ones to take the lead. Now let me say one more thing about 1 Timothy chapter 2. 1 Timothy chapter 2. The view coming from our radical feminist types is that 1 Timothy 2 was historically limited. Well, what Paul means to say, is he's telling the women at Ephesus. 1 Timothy is written about the Ephesian context. He says somewhere in there. 1 Timothy 1:3, remain on at Ephesus. He's writing about an Ephesian church. The radical feminist types want us to hear this. Well, Paul's restricting the women at Ephesus because they're out of role, because they're noisy or they're loud or they're rambunctious, they're obnoxious. And so if they would only not be that way, they could still take the lead. They just need to be in role about it. I don't know that actually makes sense for a couple of reasons. First of all, the scope of 1 Timothy and 1 Corinthians, for that matter, transcends just the Ephesian context. He's not only talking about Ephesus, he's talking about something more universal, isn't he? Number two, Paul never indicates that he's contextually limiting this to Ephesus. He says similarly to Corinth. Is the only thing Paul seeks to address is that they're noisy or obnoxious? I don't find that in 1 Corinthians 14. He told them without any conditions, didn't he? In 1 Corinthians 14, he doesn't give any conditions where the females can take the lead. He does give conditions in 1 Corinthians 14 where the tongue speakers and the prophets can. Isn't it striking when he doesn't give conditions for the women to take the lead? I think so. And that's at Corinth. That's not even about Ephesus, as in 1 Timothy chapter 2. Paul never hints that he's contextually limiting this stuff. Number 3, Paul's appeal, his argument, is consistently deeper. It goes back to the creation narrative, the worldview established by Genesis 1 through 3. In 1 Corinthians 11, listen to this. This is his big gun. 1 Corinthians 11, he appeals to the creation order. 1 Corinthians 14, he appeals to the creation order, just as also the law says. Where's the law say that? 1 Corinthians 14, 34 and 35. It's the creation worldview. It's the creation order. 1 Timothy chapter 2, 13 through 15. 1 Timothy 2, 13 through 15. What's he appeal to? The creation narrative, Genesis 1 through 3. When Paul appeals to creation, he's going way back, saying that the order, the paradigm, the model, the template that he's seeking to recover with women not taking the lead, usurping authority, goes all the way back to the creation setup, the creation order. That's far earlier than Ephesus. Paul's appeal is much deeper than just Corinth or Ephesus. It's about a worldview. And when Jesus, Matthew 19, endorses Genesis, he's doing much more than just saying a note or two about marriage, divorce, and remarriage. Haven't you read, he that created them at the beginning made them male and female? He's talking about a worldview. He's talking about an order. And 1 Timothy 2, 1 Corinthians 14, 1 Corinthians 11 is far broader than just Ephesus or Corinth. Number 4, the therefore, verse 8, piggybacks on 2, 1 through 7 of 1 Timothy, that is. If you're in 1 Timothy, look at it. 2:8. Therefore. Well, what's the therefore connect us back to? 1 Timothy 2:1 and following. Who's that about? All. It's universal. It's a universal truth. And then number 5, Paul never gives, and this is my argument, this is a big argument, in connection with the creation business that Paul makes his big gun. This is a major observation we need to make about Paul. He never gives the conditions in 1 Corinthians 14 whereby a woman could speak or take the role of the lead, take the lead role. That's striking. Why doesn't he give those conditions? It's the creation order. The woman's not to take the lead in an assembly context over the males. So let's look at this again. What's Paul saying? In order for us to have the woman usurping authority over the male and her be wrong for doing such, she needs to take the lead in a mixed audience, in an assembly context. Paul says all 3 of these things have to be present for her to usurp authority over the male in an unjustifiable way. Look at 1 Timothy 2 then, 11 and 12. A woman must quietly receive instruction with entire submissiveness. I do not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority over the man, but to remain quiet. I think all of this is balanced out, metered out by the fact that 1 Timothy 2, yet again, is in an assembly context. The woman mustn't take the lead in an assembly context with males being present. I think 1 Timothy 2 sits quite nicely in connection with 1 Corinthians chapter 14. Questions or comments on it? Shoot me an email. Drew Leonard, DREWLEONARD at live.com. Hit me as hard as you wish, and I swear I'll be godly about responding. Okay, 1 Corinthians chapter 14. Let's get back then. I think that Paul is setting conditions or circumstances on the tongue speakers, the prophets, and the women. But in the case of the women, there's never a case, so says Paul, where they should take the lead or speak in church. He's not saying they can't sing, that they can't say thank you or please, or that they can be audible, ask questions in a Bible class, something like that, or even in a sermon, ask questions. She just can't take the lead in a mixed assembly if it's an assembly context. Okay, let's go back to 1 Corinthians 14 then. Let's get some of these next blanks. Number 19, the responsibility of those in the assembly. Look, if you're one of those who just sits in the pew every Sunday, did you know you've got a responsibility too? Here it is. Number 1, pass judgment. That's what verse 29 says. You're supposed to make an evaluation of what's being said in the assembly. Is this scriptural or not? Am I shaping my faith or not? Number 2, your responsibility is to learn. Verse 31. Learn. All may learn. Number 3, be exhorted. Taught, exhorted, comforted, uplifted, be exhorted. Verse 31. And there are some references there. Matthew 7, 1 Thessalonians 5, 1 John 4. You really do want to give those a read in your own time. There's a purpose to the assembly. We're not just filling time here. We're not just checking off a quota. There's a purpose to Christian assembly, and we would do well to recover that. Some of us in our churches have done horribly. We've gotten our phones out. We scroll on Facebook. We do our grocery lists. Folks, that business is out of place. In church, we are to 14:31 learn, be exhorted, 29 pass judgment. We've got a responsibility in the assembly. Number 20, it's probable that Paul's Corinthian antagonists attempted to respond to his writing by saying that they were uncontrollable. They were uncontrollable is your next blank on number 20. Well, Paul, you don't understand. The Spirit got a hold of us this Sunday. We couldn't help it. We just had to do. No, that's not true, Paul says in 14:32. The spirits of the prophets are subject to the prophets. And it's possible that the women were even saying something like, well, Paul, you don't understand. We've got to speak in the assembly. We have questions. And Paul, recognizing that these women at Corinth are being disruptive and chaotic, says, you got questions? Ask them at home. And he just kills the whole idea that they need to just be disruptive and antagonistic in the assembly. Let me tell you what I don't think. I don't think that remark on 14:35, if you desire to learn anything, let them ask their husbands at home. I don't think Paul's saying you need to be absolutely silent and you can't ask questions at church. I think he's assuming in 1 Corinthians 14, a context that was designed, an assembly that was designed with no interaction. We sing, we pray, we have a sermon without interaction, that sort of assembly. If there were an assembly context where it was designed to have a Q&A, a questions and answers, an interactive experience, I think that Paul would have said, though females can ask questions in that context. But I think he assumes in 1 Corinthians 14, a context much like in a lot of ways our Western setup where we have singing and prayer and Lord's Supper and contribution, and then the sermon guy gets up, the preacher gets up, and he gives a sermon which doesn't have interaction. And I think Paul assumes a context like that and says, stop disrupting, stop being chaotic, stop being antagonistic, stop being interrupting. Ask your question. You really need a question answered? Ask your husband at home. But think about if you take 14:35 baldly without any kind of nuance about it. She couldn't even ask an elder outside at the restaurant. She couldn't even ask a deacon his thoughts on the text if she ran into him at the grocery store. In 1 Corinthians 14:35, Paul's just trying to kill this whole disruptive movement at Corinth. He's trying to remind them about edification first. I think he assumes a context, an assembly context, where there is no back and forth, no interaction. It's just the guy doing the sermonizing. And I think he tells the women, stop interrupting. You got questions, there's an environment for that too. Go home and talk to your husband about it. He's not saying you can't ask an elder at the restaurant, you can't ask a deacon at the grocery store, you can't ask another female. Some of these women didn't have husbands, right? And so I think he's just simply saying there's an environment. If you really have questions, there's an appropriate way to get at answering those as well. 1 Corinthians 14:35. So your next blank on number 20, I think they may have said something like, well, Paul, we got to ask our questions. We got to get our questions answered. And he says, well, there's an environment for that too. The blank on 20, they might have had questions. Number 21, Paul's argument about the female silence in the assembly is taken from, this is what he says, taken from the law. Those are your blanks on 21. He says on 14:34, it's just as the law says. He's grabbing back at Genesis 1-3. I'm sure. Back in 1 Corinthians 11, he appeals to the creation narrative. 1 Timothy chapter 2, he appeals to the creation narrative. What's he appealing to in 1 Corinthians 14:34? The law? Probably the creation narrative. The law says it. And I've got some more notes there in the workbook. Number 22, Paul's point to the women that they might have had questions is that they have an environment. Your blank on 22 is environment, where they can inquire about spiritual matters without being disruptive. Number 23, Paul makes the point sarcastically that Corinth was no exception to the rules that governed a peaceful and orderly assembly. There's another argument to just simply be said. Paul's not only writing about Corinth here. 1 Corinthians 14 and verse 36. You guys the only ones that got the word of the Lord? That's what he asks rhetorically in 1 Corinthians 14:36. You know that's not true. He says, these rules govern more than just Corinth or Ephesus. These rules govern the church, the household, the church of the living God, which is the pillar and ground of the truth. 1 Timothy chapter 3 in verse 15. Number 23 is blank as exception. Corinth is no exception to the rules that govern the church. Number 24, Paul's line on verse 37, if anyone thinks, is probably another instance where he's directly attacking the elitist party at Corinth. Yeah, I think he's probably attacking them. Look at this in 1 Corinthians 3:18. Let no man deceive himself. If any man among you thinks. 1 Corinthians 8:2. If anyone supposes that he knows anything. 1 Corinthians 14:37 is functioning the same way. If anyone thinks he is, you think you got it all figured out? 1 Corinthians 3:18. You think you know everything? 1 Corinthians 8:2. You think you're the ones that are spiritually led? 1 Corinthians 14:37. Well, get a load of this. I really am writing the commandments of the Lord. 1 Corinthians 14:37. Number 25. Incidentally, there is no mention of leadership at Corinth. What do you think could have happened if they had a good solid eldership? I think the elders could have said, we've got some problems with the tongue speakers, the prophets, and the women. Maybe we should put together a work roster. Maybe we should just go ahead and tell the men to handle their women. Tell them there's an environment for you to ask questions. It's at home. Stop being disruptive to the assembly. You think the elders could have taken the lead in that? Yeah, I think so. But the striking thing about 1 Corinthians is that we don't have any evidence that they had an eldership. Would have been early if they had one. We don't read about elders until, a little bit further in Acts. And they kind of replace the apostles in some ways. If you notice how Acts kind of has the apostles and they fade out and then the elders come onto the scene. 1 Corinthians 14, he says in 33, God's not an author of confusion. He says on 14:40, everything needs to be done properly and in an orderly manner. Good leaders or elders might have curbed the disorder and promoted this one thing in the assembly. Edification. What should our good elders and deacons and preachers and teachers be about today in the Lord's church? Edification. And of course, that's in line with good biblical scriptural principles. But it needs to be done. We need to edify the body, and we need to do it in a way that's pleasing to God. The tongue speakers, the prophets, the women were all being disruptive, chaotic, disorganized. Paul gives conditions where if they do it rightly, the tongue speakers can take the lead. But he says if you don't, then be silent. Don't take the lead. He says to the prophets, there are conditions where you can take the lead. But if you don't meet those conditions, then be silent. Don't take the lead. But to the females, he says, you're never in the assembly context to take the lead. And Paul seeks to curb the abuse of the spiritual gifts, chapters 12, 13, and 14. And he addresses some other issues, some abuses that have come up in the assembly context, as he regulates what should be and what should not be. Reasons for the female silence, I'll say one more time. The practice of the churches. If you look at verse 36, all the churches of the saints. Verse 36, this wasn't only to Corinth. Number 2, he gives reason for the female silence because the law says it. Verse 34, the law says this. Number 3, he says it's a shame for the female to take the lead in the mixed assembly context. 1 Corinthians 15:35 and 1 Corinthians 14:37. The things I'm writing are the Lord's commandment. 4 reasons in 1 Corinthians alone, 1 Corinthians 14, as to why the female's to be silent. 1 Corinthians 12 through 14 speaks to us about not only the abuse of the spiritual gifts, but it's the abuse of the assembly. When we don't seek edification, and when we don't seek edification, that stems from one place. Selfishness, lovelessness. That is consistently the problem at Corinth. This is a problem where you go to church. How can we sort this business out? Maybe we need to preach love, real, biblical, substantive love. A little bit harder. What that looks like. It looks like the word of the cross. It's transposed onto any and every issue. If we let the text lead us, we will be people that love just like Jesus did. We've used the word of the cross, and we will selflessly, sacrificially, and lovingly let the text guide us as we reorient not only ourselves individually, but the churches we attend after the image. of Jesus Christ. Thanks for joining us. We'll be in 1 Corinthians 15 next time. God bless you.